All right, so our topic today is the Islamic conquest of Syria and Iraq. That is correct?
Yes, it's Syria and Persia.
Right, Syria and Persia.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we'll jump right in, and I'm sorry if this is going to sound a little bit like a history class, but that's the topic, and I love to talk about it. So let's get right into it. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them um, at the end of the hour. I plan to speak for about 40 minutes and then take questions. All right. Um, so let me, okay. Do you all see the map?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So when we get to it, I'll make sense of the specific points in the map. But basically, if you look at the map, first of all, orient yourself so you have a sense of the Arabian Peninsula, right? And that's right at the center. And then you have to your left Africa, and immediately then to the north, you have north of Hijaz. Now I'm going to use some of this geographic names that may be strange to you, but I'll try to explain as much as I can. And then if some of you can, or rather any of you who has any questions about clarification of these terms, please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask, because if you don't, you will be confused and I won't know that you are. So Islam begins in Mecca. And can everybody spot Mecca?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So and to the north of Mecca, today only a 4-hour drive, but at that time about 8 days journey, is Medina. And yeah, very good. So now you have now if you continue going north from Medina, you'll find just north, a little bit northwest, Syria. Today, Syria consists of, or what used to be known as Greater Syria. It consists of from going from north to south, 4 different regions. It included Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, and Jordan. All of that was part of Syria. Asham in Arabic, as it was called, Asham, Ardu Sham, the land of Asham, Syria. And then if you went west from there, you'll go into Egypt. And if you went east from there, you will go into Mesopotamia, which is literally the land between 2 rivers. And today it's known as Iraq. The word Iraq just means irrigated land, just as the word Mesopotamia, between 2 rivers. And if you continue going east from Iraq, you will run into Zagros Mountains. And if you cross the mountains, or in fact, starting with the mountains, you will enter the land that is today Iran. And historically, it's known as Persia. All right. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. So let us go back to Mecca. The Prophet, peace be upon him, migrated from Mecca to Medina in the year 622. And within 10 years, he is able to bring most of Arabia under control. How? We're going to learn the story of that and how his mission proceeds and how he's able to first take back Mecca. He is sent in exile, or if you will, kicked out of Mecca by his own people, by his own family, because he's preaching the message of there is no God but one God, Allah, and that Muhammad himself was his prophet, was a prophet of God. And this message had implications that challenged the Meccans and the Arabs. The prophet moves to Medina as a prophet and as a peacemaker. Often in some of this more apologetic or Western literature, there is this understanding that the prophet moved to Medina sort of in a secular status as like a peacemaker. But if you look at this sources carefully, it's very clear that many of the Medinans had already accepted his message, and so they were giving allegiance to him as a prophet, believing in his message. But there were many non-Muslims, Jews in particular, and non-Muslim pagan Arabs who lived side by side. And as the prophet's message spread, there were a number of battles with the Meccans. The Meccans are a much more powerful city, the shrine center of Arabia before Islam, whereas Medina, which was at that time known as Yathrib, is not really even a city, not even a town. It's a settlement, or it's a collection of settlements that were at that time, that is before the Prophet moved, at war with each other. But the Prophet unites them, gives them, they embrace his religion, or some do and others don't. Those who don't embrace his religion, he makes a treaty with them, which is known in the modern period as the first written constitution in the world, or the Constitution of Medina, the Kitab of Medina. The Prophet has two major battles, or a number of battles, but the first important battle, the battle that takes place only a year and a half after his move to Medina, it's called the Battle of Badr, and you can see the place called Badr, which is right on the Red Sea. It takes place in the year 624. Can anybody see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so that's the dot there is where Badr took place. Now, by our standards, or I guess by really any standards, Badr was a very small business. It was a brawl rather than a war. It was a few hundred people fighting an army, 300 people fighting an army of 1,000. But in Islamic history, its significance is enormous. This victory gave Muslims confidence and the sense that they have a bright future. The Prophet, Arabia is the backwater. Now I'm going to talk more about sort of the big geopolitics at the time. Arabia, whether Mecca or Medina, are really, really insignificant places at this time. So even though when you look at Saudi Arabia today, this whole region that is dark green, outside of Syria and Iraq, this place is really big sand desert, and the population is extremely sparse. And whereas if you look at this, this what I call a civilizational corridor, going from, I wonder if I can point. All right, let me point using laser pointer. Okay, can you guys see my pointer?
Yes, we can.
Okay, wonderful. So you see this place from here, from Egypt, going through Syria to Mesopotamia. This entire region, let's call this great civilizational corridor of humanity. This is where the first human cities are born. This is where the first human civilizations are born. This is where most of the early inventions of everything takes place. This is also the place where all the three Abrahamic religions are either born or quickly moved to. So this is, and this is also the population centers of the world. All right. Now, compared to this, at the time of Islam, let me say one more thing. The world is divided between two great empires. There is the East Roman Empire. By this time, Roman Empire has been split into East and West. Western Empire has been mostly run over by the barbarians, or what they call barbarians. And the East Roman Empire continues for another 1,000 years. So, and this is the center of the East Roman Empire. Today it's Istanbul, and it was known as Constantinople. This is the center of the Byzantine Empire or the East Roman Empire. And this empire essentially is wrapped around Mediterranean Sea. And these are extremely prosperous ancient lands. Now, the center of the other great empire, the rival empire, which is known as the Assassinate Empire or Sasanian Empire, I'm just going to call it Sassanid because I'm used to that, is at this place called Ctesiphon. And it is in Iraq or Mesopotamia, even though the Persians or the Sassanids originally hailed from this land of Persia. Their base was in Iraq. And the reason for that is Iraq is a fertile land. It is, in fact, a straight, flat land without these two rivers. It would be one of the most barren places in the world, and flat and uninteresting. Desert and dust, that's all. But because of these two rivers, Euphrates here and Tigris, so the one to the north is Tigris, this one is Euphrates. They run south into the Persian Gulf. These two rivers are transformative. They turn this land into one of the most fertile lands, but they all require irrigation, meaning that they actually cover or fertile area around Iraq would be very small, but because of this technology that people of this region figured out to create canals and keep the water stored and not let it evaporate and all of that stuff, that allowed much better use of this land and turned it into gold. And at this time, the pre-modern world, before there is fossil fuel, all of the empires in the world throughout 5,000–6,000 years, they depend on only one thing: peasants working diligently to produce crops, and then you take care of those crops to take care. So you have larger army because you have larger amount of food, and then you can use cash crops for money, and that's how you got rich. The more agrarian land you had, and tame peasants, the richer you could be. So this was the basis for the prosperity and power of the Sasanian Empire. The rest of Iran is beautiful, but it's not comparable in its fertility to Mesopotamia, which is why the Sassanid dynasty found its basis in Ctesiphon here. So the East Roman Empire, on the one hand, is really far away. If you're thinking about Arabia here, these people are far away, and they don't have to worry too much about what's happening here, except that religiously, these are important lands. And remember, these are Christians. So for them, Jerusalem is important. But other than that, they're not immediately worried about this. Whereas for the Sassanids or the Persians, this is absolutely their jugular vein, this land. Now, the next part of her story is Arabia comes in. This is an ocean of sand, not really a power center. There is no unified government here. These are nomadic tribes with some scattered settlements. This whole land. So, which means that geography here is, or geographical expense of things is somewhat misleading, because you have these lands that have all the population and all what you may call civilization, culture, philosophy, agriculture, and this whole expanse has nothing. All right. Now, as the prophet, now I'm going to start the story of conquest with the prophet's life, even though, I mean, I assume that some of you at least have some idea about the prophet's life story, biography, or known in Arabic as the Sirah. I'm going to have to just take for granted that some of you, that you know enough for me to get going, okay? And if you have questions, please write those in chat. Let me make sure that if you write something in chat, I will see it. But if I don't, and if you have questions, okay. Right. So I can see your chat now. So feel free to ask or interrupt me if I don't see your question, if you have a clarification question. All right. The first notable occasion where the Quran mentions the word opening or conquest. In Arabic, the word is al-fatah. Fatah means opening, but it also means opening of cities, so conquest. But the first mention in the Quran of conquest is not a conquest at all, but rather it is the treaty of peace, known as Al-Hadebia, that took place in the 6th year of the Prophet's stay in Medina. I'm going to refer to years from the migration or hijrah of the Prophet, Hijri calendar, which begins with the hijrah or migration of the Prophet. So in the year 6 after hijrah, a treaty of Hudaybiyah took place that the Quran heavily praises as the first great victory. But it was no victory, it was a peace treaty. Now, long story short, the Prophet, after just a year earlier, Quraysh, that is the Meccan detractors of Islam and the Prophet, had united all of their power and the power of surrounding nomadic Arab tribes to come together and attack the Prophet in Medina. That is known as the Battle of Al-Ahzab or the Battle of Khandaq. That battle had ended in great defeat for Quraysh without any bloodshed, because of the weather and the trick of Muslims. The Muslims dug a trench, and that means that they were able to sit out this great siege. And the failure of that siege of Medina really broke the back of the Prophet's enemy, Quraysh. And the year after that, the Prophet has this dream that he is making pilgrimage or minor pilgrimage known as Umrah to Mecca. Now remember, Mecca is a shrine where everybody, the enemy, the friend, could go without interruption, without being stopped. So this was a claim to fame of Mecca. In entire Arabia, a land of anarchy, there is no government. The only thing that people care about and run their lives by is custom. And that custom and tradition was that when you go to Mecca, your friend and enemy does not matter. You put down your arms and you do pilgrimage around the Kaaba. You could not kill either on a personal or collective business. You see the killer of your father, you are duty bound to avenge the blood of your father, but you cannot do anything about it because this is the Kaaba. When Muslims go there, 1,400 Muslims, largely unarmed. When I say largely unarmed, they only had swords with them for protection when you're in a caravan and you could be attacked. So you have basic protection. You go there basically unarmed to make Umrah. Meccans say, no, we will not let you do that. That was a great violation of their own tradition. At this point, the companions of the Prophet swear the oath of death, meaning that we are going to stand by the Prophet no matter what decision he makes, if that means death. That oath scared Quraysh, and they allowed Muslims to come back next year and accepted a peace treaty with the Muslims. And that peace treaty is known as Al-Hadebia. The reason it's very significant is because this peace treaty was for the first time when the Meccans, as well as the rest of the Arabians, recognized Muslims led by the Prophet as a legitimate entity to make peace with. And part of the deal of the treaty was that the Prophet could make a deal with whoever wanted to make a deal with him, which means that rather than war, there could be peace now. And from this, scholars usually draw this lesson that Muslims ought to make peace whenever they can, because Islam wins in times of peace. And in this case, the Prophet demonstrated that as soon as he came back from Al-Hadebia and he had some peace, he began sending letters to sovereigns around Arabia. Nearly 24 letters were dispatched, some of them mostly to the Arab chiefs in Bahrain, in Oman, in Syria. There were some Arab chiefs sort of who bordered the Byzantine Empire. They accepted Islam, but most of them didn't, right? And the most dramatic cases were letters to 3 great emperors: Negus of Abyssinia, who in fact accepted Islam, embraced Islam, and then the emperors of the two great empires. Now, a letter going from the Prophet to the great Assassinate Emperor and to the great Roman Emperor, it was just a really shocking event. It was kind of like, you know, imagine a letter coming to, say, in the 80s, when you have this great Cold War going on between the US on the one hand and the USSR on the other hand, and you have a letter from Uganda that a chief, an African chief in Uganda writes a letter, I don't know, to Reagan and Gorbachev: if you don't believe in my in God's message and submit, you will have the sin of your people on your neck, that I am the messenger of God. It was just like, why would you write a letter to me? You know, who do you think you are? But in many cases, to letters that were written to lesser sovereigns, they have already seen the victories of the Prophet if you're an Arab, and you have a reason to take it seriously. So the Negus of Ethiopia, the emperor, the Christian emperor of Ethiopia, accepts it on the basis of faith. A person who is a true Christian, who in fact believes that the Prophet is God's prophet and accepts. Not so the others. The other interesting case is, so it's a letter that goes to the Assassinate Emperor. It is sent through the Arab chief of Bahrain, who has already embraced Islam. He delivers the letter to the Assassinate Emperor, who angrily tears the Prophet's letter before even reading it, just because the Prophet mentions his name before the name of the emperor and addresses him not as God, Lord, Emperor, but rather by his name. The man just tears Prophet's letter, and the Prophet says, praise to God when he hears this, may God tear his kingdom. The emperor sends his, also the Assassinate Emperor, then sends his governor in Yemen. So Yemen, which is southern Arabia, was controlled by the Persians at the time. And he sends this governor, his name is Badam in the sources, to the Prophet with the message that if the Prophet Muhammad does not desist from this new religion of his and does not submit to him, he would have him and his people killed. All right, so this is high arrogance. And the Prophet says to this letter, to this man, Badam, that you should go back home because my Lord has killed your Lord. And Badam is shocked, but it turns out a month later, news comes that in fact the son of the Persian emperor staged a coup and in fact killed the emperor. And upon this, Badam himself embraces Islam, and this is the beginning of Islam in Yemen. Third such letter, or third of these important letters, was written to the emperor of the East Roman Empire. His name is Heraclius, or Hirakil in Arabic. Fortunately, the letter and the emperor's curious reaction to it and his interview with an Arab chief are all recorded in sound reports. And Sahih al-Bukhari and elsewhere, we don't have this detail about any other letter of the 24 letters that were sent. The letter generally, so we have the text of the letter, which demands that you submit to God and the Prophet's authority, and if they do so, they may keep their kingdoms. But if they don't do so, they will have the sin of their followers as well. Now, such daring letters to great emperors were serious challenges, and the Prophet ﷺ ensured that they were taken seriously. They were sent by, seriously. They had a very serious, clear tone. When the Prophet learned that these emperors don't open letters unless they are sealed by another sovereign, the Prophet had a ring built, and in that ring it said Muhammad Rasulullah, Muhammad the messenger of Allah, and he used that to seal those letters. So the Prophet is using the custom of the time to make sure that the people understand and take it seriously. Now, any well-informed observer at this time who was looking at what's happening would have known that this was a declaration of war or insanity. Like there could be only two possible explanations for why the Prophet is sending letters. Either that you are going to carry out this threat. Now, you may say it was just a religious invitation, but it's not just a religious invitation, because the religions in each of these cases in Roman and Persian empires is the foundation of their empire. So when somebody is saying that I'm the messenger of God, you're essentially asking them that your religion ought to submit to the truth that God has sent with me. Now, this sending of letters also told everyone that the Prophet's message, alayhi salatu wasalam, was not limited to Quraysh or the Arabs, right? And it's remarkable. All of these are non-Arab sovereigns. Most of the warriors who would fight in the armies of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that later, only 10 years later, take down these two great empires, have not even embraced Islam yet. The Persians followed. They were known as Magians, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So this was the act of a prophet, for it admits of no worldly historical explanation why you would act in such a daring way while you're fully sane and politically aware of the consequences. Now, the first major expedition that the Prophet ﷺ sends that sought to bring Islam to the Christian Arabs along Syrian tribes. Remember, so far the Prophet's battles had been with either Quraysh, with either Quraysh or other pagan Arabs, or with the Jews who had been closer to the Prophet and had allied with pagans against the Prophet ﷺ. So this is the first time the Prophet ﷺ sends an expedition to Christian Arabs, and that is the 8th year of Hijrah after the conquest of Mecca. Before the conquest of Mecca in the year 8 after Hijrah, and that is known as the Battle of, or the Ma'rikat al-Mu'ta. But before I talk then further about this, let me give you some background information on Syria. The Roman rule, so Syria, we just talked about the great civilizational corridor. At the heart of that is Syria, the ancient city of Damascus. There are other ancient cities, the holy city of Jerusalem, which is recognized as holy by Jews and Christians. Now, what's happening in Syria? The Roman rule, remember we said the Romans ruled this, but they actually had not ruled this region, Syria and Egypt, for about 15 years prior. And Roman rule had just been restored to Syria and Egypt. For some 15 years, the Sassanids had conquered, and of course this is mentioned in the Quran in the famous Surah Ar-Rum, where the Quran says the Romans have been defeated, but they will overcome in several years. And this was a great prophecy of the Quran that came true, and the Meccans had challenged the Prophet and the Muslims, saying, well, the Syrians have completely routed the Romans. When will they ever come back? Well, they in fact come back. And just a few years before the Prophet sends his letters, the Romans have come back. This expedition that the Prophet now sends to a place called Mu'ta. Now let's go and look at, can everybody see Tabuk? Right, so if you keep going from Medina northwest, you will reach Tabuk. And if you keep going north of Tabuk, near where it says Ajnadain, around this time, this is a place called Mu'ta. So the Prophet had sent this sort of expedition of 3,000 men to mostly deal with the Arab Christian tribes. Exactly. This is the play. This is the battle in which three of the great Muslim commanders, and very dear, each one very dear to the Prophet ﷺ, are killed. Zayd ibn Haritha, who was previously the adopted son of the Prophet ﷺ, was very dear to the Prophet. Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, the older brother of Ali radiallahu anh, and Abdullah ibn Rawaha. These three great commanders are killed in this battle. And after that, there's no, sort of great commander left who was a senior Muslim. So Khalid ibn al-Walid, who is a great commander, but just a new Muslim, he takes charge, and he is able to save Muslims from a total annihilation. Because what had happened is that the Prophet ﷺ had sent this expedition of only 3,000 Muslims to deal with some of the rebelling, sort of troubling tribes of Qudaa. And but Muslims they run into the army of Heraclius, 200,000 men, right? So there's no match whatsoever. And Muslims are so passionate about their da'wah and the truth of the Prophet ﷺ. They say, we're going to fight, and yes, it means it's going to be certain death, but we'll embrace certain death rather than coming back. Khalid ibn al-Walid was, on the one hand, was far more practical and wise about this, and he said, saving those soldiers for a better fight, for a day that you can win, is much better than just seeking martyrdom. Anyway, so Khalid ibn Walid comes back, because this was the expedition. Now, Ibn Ishaq narrates that the Muslim commander, so this is, some of this narration is in Sahih al-Bukhari and some elsewhere. I'm not going to go into that. Now, this setback encouraged the Arab tribes around the border, who had been already relations with Romans before, and now they had new relations with the Prophet ﷺ. As they were realizing the Prophet is rising, now they began to rebel against the Prophet and Muslims again. So this became somewhat of a trouble. So what happens? The Prophet ﷺ sent a smaller another expedition known as That al-Salasil, in which Amr ibn al-As and Abu Ubaidah disciplined the rebellious tribes. After these two northern engagements, Muslims become involved with the conquest of Mecca, and so nothing happens for a year. And then after the conquest of Mecca, the Prophet ﷺ begins to prepare for the largest ever expedition, which is known as Tabuk, in the Rajab of 9th year of Hijrah. The Tabuk we just saw on the map is some 600 to 700 kilometers north of Medina. And it was so far the most daring, the most arduous, and the largest expedition that Muslims had ever undertaken. According to many sources, it had as many as 30,000 Muslim soldiers. And again, Muslims are poor. Muslims are really stretched for resources. So an army of 30,000 is takes them to the absolute limit. They have to, eat leaves when they are on this expedition because there is no food. Now, but the Prophet ﷺ goes back and he wants to confront Heraclius's army of 2,000 men or whatever he could find there. Now, it so happens that there is no actual fight at this time, but Rasulullah ﷺ establishes the power and awe of Muslims, which then allows all of these Arab tribes in the surrounding region to come into Islam thinking more peacefully, basically being at peace that Muhammad ﷺ is for real, that he is brave and courageous, and that he will back up his words with action. And that is what the Arabs honored most in a leader. So basically, this allows a lot of people to come to Islam, even though there is no actual expedition. Now, just before the Prophet ﷺ died, the year after that, he had prepared another army under the leadership of Usama ibn Zayd, whose father, Zayd ibn Thabit, had been, Al-Haritha, sorry, had been martyred. And before the army leaves Usama, Rasulullah ﷺ dies, and so this comes to a halt for a little while. Now, the Prophet's successor, Abu Bakr radiallahu anh, famously refused to hold back the army the Prophet had prepared, even though everybody was saying, well, things are completely different now. We can't do what the Prophet ﷺ was intending to do. Now we're going to have armies attack us that are around us. People are going back. But Abu Bakr was a complete embodiment of faith, that we're going to do what the Prophet said, regardless of what happens. And it turned out that politically, it was such an act, such a crazy act, that people basically said, you cannot mess with Medina. So it had a great political advantage because they saw the great courage of Muslims under Abu Bakr. Now, the expedition of Usama ibn Zayd did not actually encounter any great resistance. It was kind of like Tabuk. That means it had great political and diplomatic advantage, but it didn't actually have war. But because what was happening now in the time of Abu Bakr was Ridda. The entire Arabia, if you look at the map, these were the area from Hijaz to Yemen. These were the regions that remained solidly under Islam. This region where the Prophet, Mecca and Medina, this is known as Hijaz. This is Yemen. But three corners of Arabia that are somewhat distant Mecca, from Mecca and Medina, from Hijaz. Around here, and around here, you had false prophets start sort of competing religions and competing armies against the Prophet ﷺ. So, and this was known as Ridda. Some of the tribes of Najd here, Najd was split. This region, the central region, is called Najd, and this was split. Some remained with the Prophets and Prophet ﷺ, others didn't, or with Medina. And so you have major Ridda wars at the time of Abu Bakr, which Muslims are able to ultimately be successful in, but it's after this that our story begins with Syria and Iraq. So Abu Bakr, as soon as Ridda comes to an end and Khalid ibn al-Walid is able to defeat the army of Musaylima al-Kadhab, Abu Bakr tells him to continue into Iraq. The main order of business, however, for Abu Bakr and for the people in Medina was Syria. Remember, all this time we haven't even talked about Iraq, because the Prophet ﷺ did not focus on Iraq per se. Apart from the letter that he sent to the Assassinate Emperor, the Prophet's own military effort was limited to, or rather was focused on, Syria outside of Arabia. So now I'm going to give you somewhat of a description, and it's a dense description of the events of Syria, of conquest of Syria, and then Persia. And I'm going to use Fred Donner's Early Islamic Conquest as sort of the baseline. It's a fairly good book that breaks up the conquest and tries to make sense of the sources. The story begins with the resumption of the Prophet's expeditions in southern Syria in the time of Abu Bakr, which would be 12th year after Hijrah, or 633 AD. I'm just going to speak in Hijrah terms now. The aim, and Donner divides up the conquest of Syria into 3 phases. And I'm going to do the same. I think it's a fairly good periodization. So what he does, Abu Bakr, and calls for Shura of the Sahaba and chooses the main commanders who go, and in the first phase, the aim is to subdue the Arab tribes that roam the countryside deep into Syria. Now, Syria is now culturally split between cities and the rural areas. Cities are the centers of Roman power. You have Greek-speaking aristocrats there and Aramaic-speaking people, scribes, but the rural areas are largely Arabic-speaking nomads. So the first order of business is to bring these Arab nomadic tribes within Islam. Why? Because of course Muslims can speak their language, and they can then become the carriers of Islam into the cities, because they have those ancient cultural relations as well. Most of these Arab tribes, interestingly, have embraced Christianity. So they're familiar with the culture of monotheism and the idea of the book. The second phase begins with, as Abu Bakr radiallahu anh dies very soon, only a year after this, and under the Khilafah of Umar, that's when you will see here all of this. This is conquered in the time of Abu Bakr, that is retaken, and then that civilizational corridor that I was talking about, all of this is conquered in the time of Abu Umar. So if you look at just as the area on the map, it looks like, you know, you have almost equal conquest, time of Abu Bakr, and then Umar, and then Uthman, and Ali. But really, the bulk of it, the great population centers are conquered in time of Umar, which is why Umar is seen as such a central figure in the conquest, because he not only conquers, but he establishes an administration that then the conquests in his period are far more stable. His administration of these conquests is such that wherever armies go there, they're able to stay and move forward from there. All right. So what's happening at this time? Some towns in the second phase are taken, such as give you names if you know those, well and good. If not, nothing is lost. The city of Basra or Busra, which is to the Arab living in Arabia, Busra is the only city that you know, or the main city that you know. Most Arabs never go past Busra. And Busra, by the way, is not the same as Basra, which is in Iraq. Busra is a city in Syria that the Arabs knew. And then Gaza, today Gaza Strip, Fahl or Pella, Damascus. These cities are taken, and other cities that are also taken at this time, the second phase, are Hims and Ba'labak and some others. What's interesting is that when Muslims, because they don't have the army and personnel to control all of these cities, Muslim army conquers Hims and Ba'labak, and then they realize they cannot control Ba'labak, so they actually have to pull out of Ba'labak and Hims and other cities. But as they're pulling out under Abu Ubaidah, they return all the taxes that they had collected, saying that we collected those taxes to protect you. There was a deal, and because we are no longer going to be here to protect you, you get the taxes, your stuff back. And that, of course, was something unheard of among conquerors. That's not what you do. So people of these cities encountered these Muslims and were quickly won over. So there are two kinds of resistance that Muslims face here. First is the Imperial Army, like remember the 200,000 army that the people of Mu'tah ran into. That is Imperial Army, and that army is not local. They don't represent, they're not connected to these cities or even the rural areas. And they're, as far as the people in the city are concerned, they're simply tax collectors. And then there are cities themselves that have some defenses. Usually you have a fortress. And so you have two different types of fights. One is the fight against the Imperial Army, and then fight against the fortified cities. In the second phase, you take some cities, but you haven't met the major army yet. In the third phase, you basically, Muslims, in the year 13 to 15, so these 3 years, years 13, 14, and 15, under Umar ibn Khattab, that will correspond to years 634, 35, and 36. These were the years when two great encounters with the imperial armies take place. The first, the Battle of Ajnadain, and the second at Yarmouk. Now, you can probably see on the map, that's Ajnadain, that approximately 634, and then Yarmouk 636. The reason I say the word approximately is because the actual chronology of what took place when is highly disagreed among the early sources. We have about a dozen accounts of how this happened. Major parts of the account are the same, but they're sequentially different. So on the one hand, we can be fairly sure that something like this happened, but we can't be sure exactly when it happened. Anyway, The Byzantines, much larger and much better equipped armies, but they're nonetheless no match for Muslims' conviction, discipline, and able leadership. One of the things that comes out in this careful study is that the Sahaba are like the Prophet ﷺ in that they are extremely capable political and administrative leaders. This is not, they're not just sitting around and saying, you know, let's pray to God this happens. They're actually, you can see how in these accounts that they have a fairly amazing balance between local leadership of the commanders and the power of the center. When Abu Bakr or later Umar would send a command to to governors, you know, it on the one hand, it's trying to manage two different conquest movements, one between Syria, one on the Syrian border, the other on the Iraqi border, and that's not easy in any government, any military command, but they're able to manage that really well. That empowering local soldiers, local commanders, yet they had enough power that when Umar famously, he did not think that Khalid ibn al-Walid, A, he had made some errors, Khalid had made some errors, and B, because he never lost a battle, Umar was worried that people are beginning to think that we are winning battles because of Khalid. So he demotes Khalid, but in any other system, Khalid could have rebelled, but Khalid doesn't. And that is just really remarkable. Khalid is controlling a lot more wealth and a lot more men than, you know, Umar had access to in Medina. So if Khalid said, you know what, I'm going to take over Medina instead, he could have, but none of that. This is not possible because of the way that Muslims are disciplined, and because the Sahaba, the people around the Prophet ﷺ, are really solidly together. Now, of course, I don't want to romanticize very much. Many of these soldiers among Muslims do not have the training and the solidarity of the Sahaba. There were only a few hundred companions who were with the Prophet, who were really like a solid army together. But most of these new coming tribes do not have that. And their level of their access to the Prophet's knowledge, the teachings, is limited to just learning to read the Quran. So, you know, you have to, historically, we have to worry about this understanding how much Islam these people really knew, and it was limited. So this great discipline is a function of the exceptional solidarity among the top brass. All right. The answers, now let's answer the question, of how and why the conquest began. I'm going to talk about Iraq a little bit later, but how this conquest began has to be sought in the continuation of the Prophet's policy and the early phase of the conquest. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this point is that often apologists would say that conquests were started by the Rashidun because they wanted this world, right? So modernists especially are happy to throw anybody after the Prophet under the bus because, okay, you know, you have, as a Muslim, you have to believe in the Prophet, but you can't really, you don't have to, you know, so you can't do that to the Prophet, but you can do that to the Rashidun. But you see here, it's very clear that the Rashidun are continuing the policy that's already pretty clear at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, the Prophet, by sending the letters and already preparing an army, the Prophet has started this movement before he passes away, ﷺ. As Fred Donner writes, I think very insightfully, so let me just read the quote here. The first phase of the conquest in Syria was thus an effort to extend further the process of political consolidation that had been begun by Muhammad ﷺ, continued during the Ridda Wars, a key element in which had been the subjugation of or subjection of the nomadic Arab tribes, whose power was always a potential threat to the power of the state. By reducing to subject status the tribes of southern Syria, the Islamic State eventually reached the point at which it could unleash the series of concentrated assaults on cities and armies that was destined to bring then all of Byzantine Syria firmly under Islamic rule. All right, how am I doing on time?
I think you do have a few minutes. I think we should like cap it at like 3:10 or 3:15ish, inshallah.
Okay, well we'll cap it fairly soon. Okay. So I'm just done with the conquest of Syria, sort of. Once the great imperial armies are defeated, the cities are taken one by one, and because of the kind of conduct that people find among Muslims, most cities come easily. You see, all conquering armies use either stick or carrot. I mean, you have to always use a combination for conquest, but you try to identify with one or the other. And so, for example, when the Mongols were going around conquering, for them, using the stick, terror was essentially what was important for them. It was important to terrify their enemy. For Muslims, it was always this carrot that you're going to be disciplined, we're going to be just, and you're going to get a better deal if you come. You're going to get to keep your religion, even though we're going to call you to it, but you're going to keep it if you want. And that was in Syria, in Egypt, and cities of Iraq. After the imperial armies are conquered, it was not much of a problem. Now, in Iraq, that is going now to the Persian Empire, you have something very similar happen with a few major differences. First, most of the armies that had gone to Syria were included early Muslims, the companions, and they were mostly people from Quraysh, from the Muhajir, from the Ansar, that is from people from Medina, and from Yemen. Many of Muslims tribes that converted from Yemen stayed with Medina during the Ridda, and they became close to Medinan leadership. To Medina, Mecca, and Yemen. These were the major centers where, and Taif. That's where the leadership of the Syrian army came from. Persia was very different and was much more difficult in some ways. First, Persia was easier because their capital is close to Muslims, and Muslims conquer Ctesiphon, and the rest of the Persia now does not have leadership. But because of Persia's much more difficult terrain, it's much more rugged land, and much more vast, it takes Muslims quite some time. So you'll see that in the map here, that this and the 12 years of Uthman's, you have two fronts. In the east you have Persia, in the west you have Egypt and North Africa. That is taking place in the time of Uthman. And there's some reversals, particularly when Uthman radiallahu anh is is assassinated in Medina. And the 6 years of the rule of Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, there is no more conquest because people are struggling to hold on to that rule. When Muslims begin to have sort of a civil war within, keeping these rebellious boundaries becomes difficult. So that's the first, if you will, that's the first 30 years of conquest in the Rashidun period. This is one, and then this is another good a little bit less detail, but another useful map of these conquests. All right, so now I'm going to open up to any questions you might have.
Oh, okay. So is the lecture done? Yes. He's asking, there's a brother asking, can you suggest any book or video series that we can learn about the Rashidun conquests?
For the conquest, I suggested Fred Donner's book, Early Islamic Conquest. I think that if you want to go in detail, that's probably your best scholarly historical source. You know, it's written by an Orientalist, non-Muslim. Of course, there is the Arabic stuff, the actual sources, Al-Tabari, Ibn Kathir, Al-Zahabi. So if you read Arabic, that would be much better in some ways. Apart from that, you know, you have general accounts. I don't know, you know, you have to be more specific of what kind of generality you want. Unfortunately, Muslim accounts of these events usually tend to be, they're not concerned with technical stuff or with historical stuff. And so it really depends on what people are looking at. If you're looking for sort of spiritual accounts and, you know, not so much concerned with what actually happened, what we don't know sure happened, then Muslim accounts are fairly good. If you're just concerned with, like, you know, the big picture. If you're concerned with historiographic details, what we know, why we know, how we know it, then Fred Donner is perhaps the best.
Okay, Jazakallah khairan. And anyone else has any question? Or
well, so for those of you who are interested in Islamic history, I'm teaching a course with Al-Balagh, and I understand one of you, Mariam, is in that course. And we just did our first session today. It's a hour and a half every Sunday, starting now for next 20 weeks. We start at noon, so from 12 to 1:30. And if you are interested in that, perhaps one of you can share that
contact me,
link.
inshallah. Yes, inshallah. You guys can contact me, and I'm taking it, and it's very beneficial. We just came from learn about Orientalists or something, right? So I think, Doctor, in that lecture, you share something very profound regarding the biases of the Orientalists, which is present in the books. So maybe if you can tell us something about that too, just really generally.
So I talked about Orientalism, and I talked about, first of all, Orientalism is the term that was generally given to scholars in the 19th century who studied the East, because the word Orient just means East. So people who specialized in Africa or China or India or the Islamic world, they were all called Orientalists, and you didn't really have specialists. So anybody who knew some Eastern language, they would get a job at a university as teaching the Orient, and they would not know anything about, say, if they are an expert in Africa, they wouldn't know anything about any of that, but somehow they would be considered experts because that's the best you could do. But over time, Orientalism became a very important feature of the colonial conquest in the 19th century. 19th century is a century of greater colonial outreach by the British and the French and the Dutch. And the Dutch came first, and then the British and the French. And in the early 20th century, the British, of course, completely dominated the Middle East. And so Orientalism was seen as handmaiden of colonialism. So this controlling Muslims by knowing about them was part of the mentality. Now, over time, Orientalism has, in fact, grown to the point that you have, especially on specialized historical or legal topics, some of the really good work, some of the best works coming out that looks at Islamic stuff and Western stuff and actual evidence, and tries to deal with its own biases. But there is no way to avoid, especially when you're telling general history, which is much more of a, you could say, a theological enterprise, than when you are looking at much more detailed facts of what happened when. When you try to say, well, this is what all of this meant, this was the cause, this was the effect, this is what's happening elsewhere, when you begin to do this big interpretation, which is what people are interested in, right? If I told you right now dates of all the actual encounters between Muslims and others, you would have all fallen asleep, because you're not interested. Nobody's interested in simply dates and facts without interpretation. But interpretation is still in the hands of mostly non-Muslim Western scholars like Bernard Lewis or Michael Cook or Marshall Hodgson or Ira Lapidus. And these people, to varying degrees, bring in their own questions that are secular or liberal Christian, and that's how they interpret the world. And they choose facts from Islamic history, an angle about Islamic history that tend to emphasize those aspects. And I think that that's why there is need for surveys, general surveys of Islamic history that try to get out of Orientalism. And I like your comment. Yeah, so there are some Pakistani and other Muslim military, Arab Muslim military historians who have written good stuff about the conquest, and I think that that's some of the best stuff when it comes to the mechanics of the wars. But again, when you're dealing with the historical sources, then you need people who specialize in reconciling historical sources. And we still don't have enough on that. All right, folks. So any other questions?
It doesn't look like we have any other question, but thank you so much for your entire time. Yeah, you were very, you could see that you were very into the lecture. So thank you for teaching us, inshallah.
Wonderful.
Alhamdulillah. Yes, and I think that's it. So for everyone who is here, I am also posting like a survey, a feedback for this lecture. Please do take a minute or 2 minutes to fill that out, so I can inshallah share the responses with the doctor as well. So thank you so very much for your time, doctor. And I wish you the best. And inshallah, I'll be attending your
inshallah.
your
thank
course.
You for joining. And
so, yes,
thank you for having me. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
Yes. Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Take care.